All right, chapter 27, fluid electrolyte and acid-base balance. There's a lot going on in this chapter, but a huge amount of it is review. And so, again, this is a really great chapter to kind of put things together that we've been learning already this semester and really take the time to kind of put it into a complete picture here. So, in this first video, I'll kind of it should get through fluid and electrolyte balance, and then I'll probably make a second one to go through acid-base balance. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind is when we're talking about balance, right, any of these, it really just indicates that what you're taking in needs to equal what's going out, right? That's how these are going to be in balance. So fluid balance, what you'll notice here is that where we gain water is primarily through drinking, right? A good portion through food, right? Think about eating green beans and how much of that is actually water. And then here's that metabolic water, remember, that we made in cellular respiration. So overall, a very small component of this fluid balance. And then, of course, to make that equal, we're going to lose water as well. We see that actually, it's funny because the thing that we tend to think of first is the urine. But absolutely, we actually lose more water across the skin and the lungs. And that's really here just talking about insensible water loss. So not necessarily that you're pouring sweat, but just from those alveolar surfaces and then also this huge surface area of your body that we're constantly losing water, and then a small portion in feces as well. So fluids, keep in mind, so the whole reason we're talking about this is those fluids play such an important role. So even low levels of dehydration can start to become problematic, right? So think about all the different things that fluids are going to do in your body, right? Dissolving and transporting substances, right? We saw how blood, all these ions and proteins, right? Our hormones, antibodies, blood cells, everything has to actually be dissolved in this plasma. And so a big portion of your blood is water, and that's important for moving substances around. We will see a huge connection in this chapter with fluid status and blood volume. So what we see is that if you start to become dehydrated, your blood volume starts to drop, and then your blood pressure starts to drop. And that's going to be problematic, and we'll look a little bit at the homeostasis there. Another big thing that we often don't consider is water has this ability to absorb a large amount of energy. And so it's a huge part of the homeostasis of body temperature. So you don't see big swings in body temperature. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that so much of you is, in fact, made out of water. And then protecting and lubricating body tissues. So tears, right, which we mentioned in a previous chapter. If you think back to AMP1, you had all the it's like synovial fluid in your joints. We've been talking about serous fluid in the pericardium and the pleura, etc. Right? So lots of really important roles. And so this is an important thing to keep in mind here. When we get to talking about the functions of electrolytes, right, or electrolyte balance, it gets a little more varied, right? But a couple big things come to mind here. Remember that the electrolytes in your body have this huge role of regulating fluid balance because water follows salt, right? Wherever you put the salts, the electrolytes, is where we're going to see water moving. And so that's really important in determining, okay, are fluids moving into cells, into blood, out of blood, etc. Electrolytes, and do we remember the definition of electrolyte? A salt that dissolves in water and is capable of carrying an electrical charge. This is where we see its importance in the nervous system. So remember all the sodium and potassium. We had depolarization, repolarization, all that. You need the electrolytes to make that happen. And then we also use electrolytes in muscle. Remember the role, again, of sodium in the depolarization, potassium in the repolarization of muscles, and then a huge role of calcium, leaving, say, the sarcoplasmic reticulum and allowing actin and myosin to cross-bridge. Yeah, remembering this? So not only is important in sending these nervous signals that are then going to tell, say, skeletal muscle to contract, but actually in that contraction. Cardiac muscle, of course, doesn't need a nerve to tell it to contract, but absolutely we'll see different electrolyte, different ion levels being of really big importance here. Now, if you kind of think about the balance of electrolytes, again, gains have to equal losses. We're gaining electrolytes in places like food and drink, right? It's really just absorption across the GI tract, the small intestine. Losses, kind of predictable here, places like sweat, urine, feces. So, losing these electrolytes at places like the kidney, and then also in the digestive tract. So we'll look at some specifics of how different electrolytes kind of fit this picture, right? So, what does it mean if sodium is high or low, or potassium is high or low, that sort of thing. Okay, and then finally in this chapter we'll go through acid-base balance. And again, here we're looking at really a balance between hydrogen production, right? So how we gain hydrogen and our losses of hydrogen. So we'll see that we can gain hydrogen through lots of different metabolic reactions, right? That's our primary way of actually gaining hydrogen is metabolic reactions. And we've already seen that a few times, even in the red blood cells, in the lining of the stomach, right? Places where we can produce those hydrogen ions. We also lose hydrogen ions, places like the kidney. We were just talking about how you can actually secrete hydrogen into the filtrate, right, to get it to leave the body. We also talked in the respiratory tract about our equation, right? And so that hydrogen can actually join bicarbonate, go to carbonic acid, and eventually be exhaled as CO2. So we'll see that the kidney and the lung are basically our main places that we lose hydrogens. So we'll come back to acid-base balance. So let's go ahead and start by thinking about fluid balance. Okay, so, and I apologize, I pretty much just took images from the previous book, but I found them maybe more useful. So now you have both. That's the optimistic way to look at this, right? So one thing to notice here, right, is who has more water, right? On average, males or females. Okay, if you can read a pie graph, you just said, oh, well, over here on males, it says they're 60% water. Females are only 50% water. So males have more water. Why is that? So what it really comes down to is, again, on average, males have more lean body mass, right? They have more protein, more skeletal muscle, where females tend to have more adipose. And then if you think about that, adipose, right? It's a fat, so it's hydrophobic. They don't hang out together. And so adipose tissue is really only about 10% water, where if you look at protein, something like skeletal muscle, it's 75% water. Okay, and so that's really the big difference there. Another thing to notice on here is if you just look at this kind of water component here, do notice that there's actually more intracellular fluid, right? ICF is intracellular fluid within the cells than there is as extracellular fluid. So my old book said about 2/3 ICF to 1/3 ECF. That's probably not a perfect number, but it's close enough. We'll go with it. So again, that intracellular fluid, you're thinking of inside of the cells. What's in the cytosol? The extracellular fluid is maybe a little more complicated. So notice the big components here, right? So interstitial fluid, that's extracellular fluid that's just kind of bathing the cells. Plasma, that's going to be the fluid obviously in your bloodstream. And then when they say other body fluids, that would be things like cerebral spinal fluid, maybe lymph, synovial fluid, serous fluids, right? Things around the pericardium or the pleural or the peritoneal cavities, right? That kind of thing. That's a pretty small percentage there, less than 1% of all the body fluids. Okay, so more ICF than ECF. And we've got a few different components, particularly interstitial fluid and plasma for extracellular fluid. Now, if you think about this line as kind of being the wall between ECF and ICF, realize that there is a wall, a membrane between the ECF and the ICF, right? Inside of the cells and outside of the cells are separated by a plasma membrane, by a selectively permeable membrane. And so, males versus females. Okay, this is where I wanted to be. So what we'll see, get out of your way here. I can't get out of the way. Okay, that's as out of the way as I get. So, sorry. So what we're looking at here, right, is if you think about, notice what they've done, ECF, extracellular fluid. In fact, they split it up into plasma and interstitial fluid in case you care about the tiny details here, right? Same thing, extracellular fluid, plasma, interstitial. And then over here in yellow is the intracellular fluid. What I wanted to point out, right, is that you have this selectively permeable membrane between these two compartments, between the ECF and the ICF. And so what we'll see is that we're actually able to set up different kind of environments outside of the cell and inside. And so what we'll find is that if we look at cations, right, positively charged ions, outside of the cell, the dominant cation is sodium, right? Inside of the cell, the dominant cation is potassium. And then someone always asks, like, well, why is that? And this is one of those, like, I have no idea, right? Other than to say, that's the way the cell likes it, right? The cell likes more potassium inside. Now, as far as remembering this, thinking about things like the way neurons and the way muscles worked, right? And you had that resting membrane potential and cells were leakier to sodium. So there's more sodium outside and you're getting that slight negative charge on the inside. I think that helps. You could think about the sodium potassium pump, who is kind of constantly working against the leakiness of the cell. So there's more sodium outside of the cell. It keeps trying to leak in. The sodium potassium pump is going to kick sodium out and force potassium in, right? So the sodium potassium pump is active transport. It's always going against the concentration gradient. It's putting sodium outside. There's more sodium outside. It's putting potassium inside. There's more potassium inside. Anyway, however that works for you to help get that memorized. And then, I mean, you can look at smaller details as well, right? We see more magnesium inside the cell. When we look at anions, again, we set up very different environments inside of the cell and outside of the cell. You'll notice in the extracellular fluid, we find a lot more chloride. Inside of the cell, we're much more likely to find proteins, and these are anionic proteins, proteins with a negative charge. That's pretty much how they are. And then phosphate. So HPO4 2- is phosphate. And so those are the intracellular anions. So I think the thing to keep in mind here, right, is that while concentrations of ions differ from inside to outside, that the osmotic concentrations end up having to be equal, right? Because water flows freely across this membrane by osmosis. So even though you have more sodium inside of the cell and you have more potassium inside of the cell, you need about equal levels of cations. Otherwise, right, water would just want to run in a direction. And it shouldn't even just be cations, all ions, right? So then you would include outside of the cell sodium and chloride, right, and some of these smaller constituents, and inside of the cell, potassium and phosphate and proteins. But they have to basically be isotonic to each other. Otherwise, water is going to flow down its concentration gradient and equalize them, right? So inside to outside of the cell, we'll see equal osmotic concentrations. Okay, and so the regulation of fluid balance and electrolyte balance are super intertwined. So I'm kind of like, I'll talk about water and then I'll talk about electrolytes and then I'll talk about water and then electrolytes. But realize, particularly because of osmosis, they absolutely are intertwined. Okay, so sorry, this gets a little silly. So when we talk about maintaining that fluid electrolyte balance, we've got some basic concepts here. So in our attempt to maintain homeostasis, right, the mechanisms that maintain homeostasis are going to monitor and adjust the composition of the body fluids, right? The extracellular fluids, not the ICF. We don't have little probes, little sensors going into each and every one of our cells and saying, okay, what's going on, with fluid electrolyte balance? No, we monitor and adjust the extracellular fluid. Things like plasma and cerebral spinal fluid are these big compartments that we're going to use to determine homeostasis. Okay. We'll also see that the receptors that we have check plasma volume and osmotic concentration, not the overall fluid or salt amounts, right? So we're not ever measuring this, say, in liters or in grams, right? We are getting concentrations, right? Osmolarity and things like that. Okay. You guys already know this one. Water follows salt. There is no active transport of water in the body. So if you want water to move somewhere, you put salt there and water is going to follow it. Okay. And I mentioned this at the beginning. If we're trying to get balance, we have to have losses and gains coming out equally. Okay. Does that make sense? You can't answer me. All right. In order for this homeostasis to work, there's a huge hormonal role. And again, this is where it's review. We've talked about all of these. So just a reminder, ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, is released from the posterior pituitary. Very good. And it's released in response to osmoregulators in the hypothalamus, right? So the hypothalamus, that region of your brain, is actually sensing, again, the concentration of the blood plasma, okay? And so then ADH is going to stimulate water conservation in the kidneys, right? If you use ADH, you put more water channels into the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubule, and water is going to be able to be reabsorbed. Aldosterone is released from the adrenal cortex, good. And it's going to, of course, stimulate sodium reabsorption and potassium loss, right? This happens at the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. Again, the hormone is actually going to that region of the kidney. It's putting in channels so that sodium can move into the cell. But what we're going to see is to maintain that osmotic concentration, right? So water doesn't just like move into those cells as well. We're going to go ahead and lose potassium in the urine. Okay, so sodium reabsorption and subsequent potassium loss in response to aldosterone. We're sensing the need for this both in the adrenal cortex and often through the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So aldosterone is often released in response to renin production. Okay. The natriuretic peptides, again, are released by those overstretched cardiac muscles. So when blood pressure gets too high and the heart stretching just a little too much, right, we release ANP and BNP, and these block the action of both ADH and aldosterone. Okay, so you're going, yeah, I've got this. Totally got this, right? So maybe bigger to recall or to commit to memory, right, that we're always looking at extracellular fluid and we're looking at concentrations, not actual amounts. Okay, so this is just a picture again of showing things like ADH acting on the DCT and the collecting duct. And I did want to remind you, right, we have lots of water reabsorption going on at the PCT and say the descending nephron loop, but that is what they're calling obligatory. Those water channels are always present. And if there is more solute outside of the renal tubule, then the water will follow. In the DCT, in the collecting duct, it's facultative water reabsorption because it's really hormonally regulated. Okay, so fluid movement in the extracellular fluid. So we've talked about this, again, another review here, right, that fluids are going to move from the plasma, right? That's extracellular fluid, out of the blood and bathe the tissues. Then we call it interstitial fluid. And then that interstitial fluid is going to get collected in the lymphatic system and eventually go back to the plasma, right? So what I want you to keep in mind is in the extracellular fluid, we're moving between these chambers isn't the right word, but these different kind of pools of where this fluid is, right? Plasma to interstitial fluid or back into plasma, interstitial fluid into lymph back to plasma. So just a quick reminder that the movement between, say, plasma and the interstitial fluid is based off of hydrostatic pressures and colloid osmotic pressures. So it's not a matter in this case of just, okay, where is there more salt? That's where water wants to go, right? So if you have more salt out here, absolutely, water wants to come out here. If you have more salt inside or some other proteins are huge in this, right? Water wants to move in. That's the osmotic pressure. But then we also have to take into account the hydrostatic pressure, things like blood pressure, right? Trying to force that filtration. Tissue hydrostatic pressure, trying to force it back in, and on and on. Overall, there should be probably a little more, this is showing a balance, right? No net filtration movement. We tend to actually have more filtration than reabsorption, right? Notice 24 liters a day actually being filtered out of capillaries. Then there is reabsorption. The other 4 liters, of course, then is going into the lymph. Okay, so fluid moves between compartments in the extracellular fluid. And then fluid is also going to shift in and out of cells. Right? So again, they're trying to show you here this balance. Intracellular fluid, there's more of it, right? It's about 2/3. Then there is extracellular fluid, but notice the two solutions are isotonic. They're trying to show the same concentration of dots, right, of solutes in here. But what you're going to see is if you increase the osmolarity of the extracellular fluid. So in this case, the volume went down. Say you started sweating, right? The volume went down, but the salts stayed more or less the same. That is going to make the extracellular fluid hypertonic compared to the intracellular fluid, the fluid inside of the cells. And so what we're going to see is this shift where some of the volume of the cells leaves and actually replaces that volume, right? Brings us back to the point where we're in equilibrium. And so this is kind of neat. The ICF acts as a reservoir, as backup fluid, so that if we do lose some of that blood volume, which would make our blood pressure drop, if we do lose some of that blood volume, we actually donate fluid from the cells. Okay, the opposite would also be true then. If you if you went the opposite direction, right? If you drank so much water that you actually decreased the osmolarity of the ECF. Drinking lots of water, absorbing lots of water, you start to dilute the plasma. Water is going to leave the extracellular fluid and go into the intracellular fluid. Now, this can lead to what's called hyponatremia, low salt levels, right, in the blood. And this is actually lethal. And really the problem with this is as that water starts following the salt into the cells start to swell. And we kind of looked at that in lab. Maybe you did that in first semester. You probably did that first semester. Say a red blood cell put in a hypotonic solution, a hyponatremic solution, would actually swell and potentially explode. And this is particularly problematic. The swelling is particularly problematic in neurons, right? They do not like to swell. They tend to die. So you go into a coma and you die. So that's problematic. So that's often called, it starts to have those effects on the CNS. And so hyponatremia is often also called water intoxication. I think that one's pretty fascinating. But what is more common would be, this kind of situation where you have something like dehydration, that intracellular fluid is replacing that extracellular fluid to make sure that your blood volume and blood pressure don't drop, but you hit a point where you don't have more ICF to give, right? And so as that plasma volume drops and the blood pressure drops, if you don't have enough fluid to replace that, this is when you start going into what would be called hypovolemic shock. And so things like sweating and diarrhea, vomiting, blood loss would lead to hypovolemic shock. It also, dehydration also depends. But in dehydration, like in this example, if you were sweating, say, and lots of those salts were staying behind, you would become hypernatremic, right? That's actually why the fluid is coming out of the ICF. That's actually going to be able to stimulate renin release, aldosterone release, thirst, and so you should ideally be replacing that volume. Okay. So now we're going to focus, right? And again, fluids and electrolytes are super tightly tied, like we just saw in, hyponatremia. It's low salt levels because you have higher water levels, right? But I did want to kind of talk through what happens with electrolyte balance, electrolyte imbalance, right? Because electrolyte concentrations directly affect water balance, right? And as we mentioned early on here, electrolyte concentrations really do affect cell functions, particularly we worry about cardiac cells, but then also to a lesser degree, neurons. Those are kind of important, and then skeletal muscle cells. But a lot of these things you'll actually see really quickly in the heart, and then also the nervous system and the muscular system. So sodium imbalances tend to be more of a problem in neurons. Potassium, calcium tend to show up pretty quickly in cardiac muscle. Okay, so let's start. This one is showing sodium, right? And so notice what happens here. So we're saying, hey, we should have normal sodium concentrations. Again, this is always monitored in the ECF. If sodium levels rise, right, the hypothalamus is stimulated. It tells the posterior pituitary to release ADH, right, which is going to stimulate thirst and also prevent water loss at the kidney. Remember, with ADH, we are stimulating the release of ADH. With ADH, we will get more water reabsorption in the kidney, right? And the other thing that happens here, and these are kind of simultaneously, it's not like there shouldn't really be an arrow here. The other thing that happens, right, is as you have higher salt levels in the ECF, water shifts out of the ICF, right, into the ECF to try to get equilibrium, right? So that lowers sodium concentration. So between the two of those, we restore homeostasis, decrease the sodium levels enough, right, that we're back to normal. Now, the other way, right, so something like a hyponatremia, say there's lower levels of sodium in the ECF, the hypothalamus is still doing the sensing. And this time what we're going to do is block the release of ADH, right? We're no longer thirsty and we allow water loss to increase. So again, this isn't always directly related to how much water you have, but the salt levels, right? The osmolarity of your blood is what's being checked. And in this case, your hypothalamus is going like, right? It's like, we got way too much water because the fluid isn't salty enough. The hypothalamus doesn't know how many liters of water you have. It can just tell that the plasma is dilute. Okay, and so it says, well, I know how to fix this. We'll just flush water at the kidneys, quit drinking, right? That water loss reduces the volume, that concentrates the ions, right? And we come back to homeostasis. So do you see how like tightly water and these electrolytes are going to work together? Because absolutely what we see here is changing water levels to actually get the ion concentration correct. Because we don't work in overall volumes, we work in osmolarity. Okay, this graph, even more crazy, right, is showing how fluid volume and sodium ion levels go together, right? So notice here, we were at homeostasis, right, a normal extracellular fluid volume. if ECF starts to increase, either because we've gained too many fluids, right? Or we've got fluid gain that goes with sodium, right? Either way, we're getting increased extracellular fluid volume, right? That's going to increase blood volume. That is going to stretch the heart, and we release the natriuretic peptides. Okay, so here we go. We go ahead and oppose both aldosterone and ADH. So at the kidney, we're going to increase sodium loss, we increase water loss, we get rid of thirst, right? We've inhibited any of these hormones that would tell us to hold on to water, and we dump. Okay, so we drop the blood volume, we drop the blood pressure. As that volume decreases, we come back to homeostasis. If we went the other way, right, our blood volume is dropping. It's actually our body sensing this decrease in blood pressure. Remember, that happens at the kidney. Here we go. We got renin, okay, aldosterone, ADH. And so those guys together are telling us to retain sodium and therefore hold on to water. And we're thirsty, so we're drinking and we up the blood volume. Okay, so those salt and water levels really are working together. And I'm really glad that my body does this and I don't have to keep track of it. Like, I'm just thirsty. I didn't know that, well, maybe it's because I've been eating a bag of pistachios that are super salty, right? And I was getting a little hypernatremic. And so sure enough, thirst right there. Okay, that's actually probably what's going on. I'm glad I don't have to think about it, right? And the hypothalamus is taking care of a lot of this for me. Okay, on to potassium. So potassium. So we get normal potassium levels. If they fall below that, it's referred to hypokalemia, low potassium. So remember, on the periodic table, or as we're abbreviating potassium, it's a K. So kalium is what would be Latin name for potassium. So hypokalemia, low potassium, hyperkalemia, high potassium. Remember, this is the major intracellular cation. It is going to move in and out of the blood. Okay. We gain potassium through our diet. Things like bananas, right? We lose potassium primarily at the kidney, right? So the rate of tubular secretion of potassium, right? How much potassium is getting put into the filtrate you secrete it to excrete it. How much is getting peed out? If extracellular potassium levels get high, the kidney is told to secrete it. If you have a low pH, this is interesting, if you're becoming acidic, you actually decrease your potassium losses because you end up exchanging hydrogen instead of for sodium instead of potassium. So remember, we said potassium and sodium usually switch places. If you're acidic, you actually choose to dump those protons instead of potassium. So that would change your balance. And again, a normal way to lose a lot of potassium is particularly when aldosterone is in play, telling you to reabsorb sodium, and you need to kick out a cation to deal with that. So hypokalemia. So here's the big things that are going to cause it. Particularly, I mentioned this last week, I think, right? That you are going to see diuretics. That basically diuretics they're telling you to pee. You're trying to flush a ton of extra liquids. And basically what happens there is the volume of urine is so high that you're just like flushing out electrolytes. And so you're losing potassium in that way. And that's a really classic to see someone on diuretics developing hypokalemia. In fact, they created a whole new set of antidiuretics called potassium sparing diuretics that try to get rid of this side effect. They're pointing out much less common this aldosteronism, where you're constantly the endocrine system is releasing too much aldosterone. So think about the diuretics, but your patient, if they have hypokalemia, right, we start seeing things like muscle cramps, actually even affecting the diaphragm, so getting some respiratory depression, so not breathing as rapidly. This can affect the heart, and so you'll see things like an irregular ECG. There's a lot of different things there. Hyperkalemia can be just as bad. And so they're pointing out here what I was talking about with constant like acidic conditions, right? You hold on to the potassium and you're dumping hydrogens instead. So when sodium's reabsorbed, hydrogen is dumped, and so then potassium keeps hanging out, right? So we're not excreting potassium at the kidneys anymore when we're dealing with acidosis. Also, you would see hyperkalemia more frequently in people with kidney failure. So their kidney isn't working properly. Definitely think about lots of electrolyte imbalances if the kidney isn't working. And then they're also pointing out some potential like kind of pharmacologic reasons that you might see a patient with hyperkalemia. The big thing here, again, is a big effect on the heart. So getting these cardiac arrhythmias, right, when so the heart's not beating properly. And this, of course, can also be quite problematic. So you're watching these potassium levels. Okay, calcium. So here's a blast from the past, right? The endocrine system at the very beginning of this semester, right? We talk about the fact that calcium, 99% of it is stored in your bones, right? But you need it for that muscular contraction, right? To let actin and myosin attach. And so we've got parathyroid hormone, which we see here, parathyroid hormone helping to increase blood calcium levels by acting in 3 places, right? It tells osteoclasts to release calcium from the bone where you were storing it. It indicates to the intestine that we should absorb more calcium. And then also tells the kidney not to let calcium go, right? Decrease the losses in the urine. And all 3 of those things together are going to raise the blood calcium levels. We do need vitamin D in order for that to actually happen properly. So it's almost like parathyroid hormone can't work without calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D. Calcitonin then is the thyroid hormone that lowers blood calcium levels. So it encourages osteoblasts to lock that calcium away in the bone. It tells the intestines to let it on through, right? We don't need that much calcium. And here we see way more calcium being excreted in urine at the kidney, right? And so this is all 3 of those together is going to decrease blood calcium levels. So when you think about hypercalcemia, hypocalcemia, this is not the most common electrolyte imbalance, right? Often this has to do with a disorder, say with something like the parathyroid, right? A tumor, say that's secreting too much parathyroid hormone, and next thing you know, we have hypercalcemia, high blood calcium levels. This is going to be problematic. So you do increase like calcium deposition in places it shouldn't be, whether that's a really problematic place is when that happens in arteries, right? So adding that to atherosclerosis, to hardening the arteries, that calcification. It can, hypercalcemia, high blood calcium can also lead to cardiac arrhythmias, which is problematic. Low blood calcium levels, you would worry about things like muscle spasms, cardiac arrhythmias, osteoporosis, right? Because with hypocalcemia, I should be showing you the other picture. If you have low blood calcium, right, you might be trying to constantly get more out of the bones, right? So that could lead you to osteoporosis. Okay, so not the most common one. I would say, honestly, the potassium, the sodium and the potassium are the really big ones. You can get imbalances. The book goes through imbalances of things like magnesium and phosphate as well. They're both really important ions, but much less common situations. So I'm going to take a quick break and then we're going to talk about pH. Actually, I'm just going to pause this. Let's make it one video. All right, we'll finish up chapter 27 then, looking at acid-base balance. Again, balance means that our gains need to equal our losses, and we talked about how the gains are often out of some sort of metabolic process, and the losses are occurring primarily at the kidney or the lungs. So, blood pH should be between 7.35 and 7.45, and we need to maintain this pretty tightly. If you get too far away from that, either on the acidic end or the basic end of things, you start to disrupt the stability of the plasma membrane. So you don't want to get below 7.35. We refer to that as acidosis, but you also don't want to get above 7.45. Again, altering the plasma membrane, altering the protein structures, enzyme function, all these things. Basically, if you drop below 7, you're gonna die. And if you go above 7.45, you're in alkalosis. I want to say it's like at 8, probably that's death on that end. So acidosis and alkalosis, they do end up affecting all the systems in your body, right? The proteins, the enzymes, the cell membranes, but especially this shows up pretty quickly in things like the nervous system and the cardiovascular system. So what we're looking at as we talk about acid-base balance, right? When we think about acids, and again, we're thinking about the production of hydrogen through metabolic processes. The production of bicarbonate is really regulated and really just used to kind of buffer out these hydrogens. So we're really just following the acid side of things. So acids really come in 3 different forms. The first one that they're mentioning here are the fixed acids. These don't leave solution. So things like sulfuric acid that results from deamination of amino acids in the kidneys, right? The kidneys are going to eliminate these fixed acids. Organic acids. So these are the acids that are produced like lactic acid, right? So part of cellular metabolism, here they're pointing out lactic acid from anaerobic cellular respiration. These end up getting metabolized really quickly. Remember, we sent that lactic acid to the liver, to the Cori cycle, and so they're saying down here, significant accumulations don't occur. So we're not that worried about organic acids. The class that we'll talk about the most are the volatile acids. So volatile just means that this acid can become gaseous, and that's exactly what we see with carbonic acid, right, is that it can move into this gaseous form of carbon dioxide. Okay, so those are 3 main categories of acids, and really it's the volatile acids that we talk about the most, but that's a good time to remind you, right, that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the pH are inversely related. So as this gas, CO2, increases, we're going to see a decrease in tissue pH and vice versa. Lower levels of CO2 are going to lead to higher, more neutral or more alkaline, even pHs. So PCO2 is actually the most important factor in determining the pH of body tissues. Again, it's the volatile acid that we're going to talk about the most. And you love this equation, so why not? So again, PCO2, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, is the most important factor in determining the pH of body tissues. So if we're trying to stay in this really narrow window, what we're going to see is our body has a few different ways of trying to maintain homeostasis. So the first thing that it does is it attempts to buffer changes in pH. So a buffer basically is going to prevent big swings in pH. It tries to keep things close to neutral. So when you're looking at buffers, typically they're a weak acid or a weak base. A weak acid is willing to donate a little bit of hydrogen, right? And a weak base is willing to accept a little bit of hydrogen. And so then if you have some weak acids and weak bases, right, you can keep things close to neutral. Okay, there's a few different classes of buffers. By far, I want to say the most important, and now I'm just going to say my favorite. My favorite buffers are the proteins. Notice that these are important buffers both inside of the cells and outside of the cells. So the cool thing with proteins, what makes them my favorite, is if you think back to the actual structure of an amino acid, right? So we have a central carbon that has a hydrogen and a variable group, right? That's what makes each of the 20 amino acids different. But then, right, every protein, every amino acid has an amine end. That's the nitrogen group, right? Amino acid, an amine end and an acid end. So the amine group is actually willing, how is this? The amine group is willing to accept hydrogens, and then the acid group is willing to donate hydrogens. This is written very strangely. If the pH falls, if the pH is becoming more acidic, we see the amine group gaining this hydrogen. That's why I'm confused. If the pH is rising, if it's becoming more alkaline, if it's higher, right, then the acid end is willing to donate hydrogen. So proteins act both as weak acids and as weak bases, which makes them amazing buffers. So the thing then that needs to happen, right, is proteins can only buffer so much hydrogen, and eventually if you want to get rid of that hydrogen, you're going to have to move it out into the extracellular fluid, right, and find somewhere else to work on that. We talked about hemoglobin being a buffer in the respiratory system, and on and on. Okay, the carbonic acid buffer system, we said we'll talk about a lot. Sorry, where did it go? So the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, we've already talked about this, right? CO2 and water at the lungs can become carbonic acid and dissociate into hydrogen and bicarbonate, right? So the nice thing is carbonic acid is your weak acid, right? It's willing to donate a hydrogen. Bicarbonate is a weak base. It's willing to accept that hydrogen, right, and move this way. And so what they're showing here, what they're showing here, right, is you can only buffer as much hydrogen as you have bicarbonate. So the kidneys can make bicarbonate, so that gives us more ability to buffer more and more hydrogen. And then the other thing that happens, I'm in the way, is we have what's called the bicarbonate reserve. So you actually have sodium bicarbonate also in your bloodstream. And if we need more bicarbonate, if we have to buffer more acid, we can actually release that bicarbonate. And so we have more there. And so then in this particular picture, they're showing what we do if there's like a fixed acid or an organic acid. So again, here's our sodium bicarbonate reserve. There's our bicarbonate accepting this hydrogen. And then in that way, we are able to move that acidity out of the body. Couple things with the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffering system is you have to have a functional respiratory system for this to work. If the problem is at the lung can't fix this, right? So if you run into things like COPD and asthma and stuff like that, this is a super important buffering system, and we can't use it, right? So we need the respiratory system to be functioning. So, okay, so we have the protein buffering system, we have the carbonic acid buffering system, and then I also want to mention this phosphate buffering system. This is clearly more important in intracellular fluid. And so if you went back to that graph, you would find under the anions the phosphate inside of the cell. And that's an important buffer. It's willing to accept another hydrogen and donate a hydrogen. So phosphate can go kind of either way. It can either be HPO4 or it can be H2PO4. So there's also an ammonia, ability of ammonia to buffer. We'll see that some in the urine, right? Ammonia is NH3, but it's willing to take another hydrogen and become NH4, ammonium. So anyway, buffers are really important. They're tying up the hydrogen, but it's still eventually going to need to be taken care of at the kidney or lung. And so when I talk about pH, right, I typically think of buffers acting first, right? They're trying to buffer change in pH. They're trying to make it so we don't get too far away from that. But it really comes down to then the lung and the kidney coming in, stepping in, and fixing the problem. So respiratory compensation and renal compensation acting to keep pH normal, right? So we were just talking about what goes on at the lung. And again, what you're going to do then is change the respiratory rate in order to change the amount of CO2 in order to change the pH, right? Because again, increased CO2, decreased pH. How do you get increased CO2? You decrease respiratory rate. So a decreased respiratory rate is going to let CO2 build up. It's not getting expelled, which is going to drop your pH. That gets a little confusing, doesn't it? And vice versa. So if you're hyperventilating and you're blowing off a bunch of CO2, you drop the CO2 levels and now your pH rises. You can become alkaline, right? So the lung, this respiratory system, is super important in fixing this. The kidney also plays a huge role. It's not as quick as the lung, but it is an important function here in maintaining blood pH levels. So this one's kind of crazy, but basically, right, bring it back. You're changing the rates of basically hydrogen and bicarbonate reabsorption and secretion, right? And so what they're showing here, oh, this is interesting. They're actually showing how ammonia can buffer hydrogen, phosphate can buffer hydrogen, and how carbonic acid can buffer hydrogen in the urine. You can have slightly acidic urine, but it's never super acidic, right? You actually have to have buffers in the filtrate in order to get rid of hydrogen here. Anyway, right? So what we see happening here, right, is we have this ability to reabsorb bicarbonate while we're dumping hydrogens into the filtrate. And then we also have the ability to reabsorb hydrogen while dumping bicarbonate into the filtrate, right? And so at the kidney, we can do this either way. So the kidney really assists the lung. If the lung isn't working, the kidney typically, it'll try to compensate, but it's typically not going to be able to keep up there. Okay, so that just leaves us to talk about kind of acidosis and alkalosis. And so remember, acidosis is when that pH drops low, right, below 7.35. Alkalosis is when it goes above 7.45. And there's two ways that you can get each of those, right? So it can be a respiratory cause, respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, or it can be a metabolic cause, metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis. So let's take a look. So, and sorry, this picture, yeah. Okay, this one will work. So let's start with respiratory acidosis. So basically respiratory acidosis, what causes it is hypoventilation, right? So right here, hypoventilation, you decrease the breathing rate, you hold on to more CO2, and that drops your pH, right? And so what we see here in response, right, respiratory compensation, if the lung is functional, it would like to increase respiratory rate, right, and correct that. So you have like these kind of minute changes that are adjusting your respiratory rate without you even knowing it. But assuming that there's something really wrong here at the kidney or at the lung, we would absolutely expect the kidney to jump in, right, and secrete hydrogen, dump that hydrogen, and hold on to bicarbonate. And then they're pointing out, of course, those other buffer systems are involved there. Between, hopefully, the lung and the kidney, we're able to decrease the PCO2 and bring the pH back to normal, right? One of the things that also often happens, though, is if you're hypoventilating, right, and that's putting you into this respiratory acidosis, and again, something has to be wrong. You sitting here, you wouldn't just lower your respiratory rate. As soon as that happened, as soon as CO2 started rising, you would automatically adjust and breathe faster. But think about being on like a mechanical ventilator. If you don't have it adjusted quite right, this could put someone in respiratory acidosis, right? Or a variety of different lung conditions. Okay, so one of the other things that happens due to hypoventilation is you might not be getting enough oxygen, right? And so then that could actually push you into a situation where you'd have metabolic acidosis, right? Increased hydrogen ions from metabolic reactions. Anaerobic respiration, you're making lactic acid, right? And so metabolic acidosis, they're not showing it on here, right? But think about lactic acid, right? Whether it's from the hypoxia, because you're hypoventilating, or hypoxia from some other reason, strenuous exercise, right? Things like that. You produce more metabolic acids, okay? Ideally, your respiratory system would fix that. The other big way to get metabolic acidosis, so let me see if, here we go, right? So increased hydrogen production or decreased hydrogen excretion. The big two ways to get more hydrogen, lactic acid production or the production of what we call ketone bodies or keto acids, right? Often this type of metabolic acidosis would actually be called ketoacidosis. And that's going to be really common in diabetes, right? When cells can't get enough glucose, so either diabetes or even something like starvation, they're going to start trying to use other fuel sources, right? Lipids, proteins, and that protein breakdown often leads to these molecules called ketone bodies or keto acids. And so that would be metabolic acidosis. Again, we expect the lung and the kidney to get involved here, right? So elevated hydrogen equals low pH. Respiratory compensation, right? Blow it off. We increase the respiratory rate. We tell the kidney, go ahead and secrete hydrogen, reabsorb bicarbonate, right? And we bring things back into order. It's always the kidney and the lung. Other ways you might get metabolic acidosis if the kidney is malfunctioning, right? If it's unable to dump hydrogen, or potentially if you're taking diuretics, that's affecting the sodium transport and therefore the hydrogen transport, right? You should be, if you're developing lots of hydrogen ions, as sodium gets reabsorbed, hydrogen should be secreted. But with some of those diuretics, you're so focused on getting rid of the sodium and the extra fluid that you can actually fail to get rid of those hydrogens. You could also get metabolic acidosis from the loss of bicarbonate. So something like chronic diarrhea, right? We're usually making bicarbonate. Any bicarbonate in the GI system is normally reabsorbed, but with diarrhea, it moves through so quickly, right? And it's so dilute that we lose the ability to reabsorb bicarbonate. And so without that normal bicarbonate from the GI tract, you could also move into acidosis. Okay, so multiple ways kind of for this problem to happen, right? Increased hydrogen production or decreased hydrogen excretion. Let's look at alkalosis. Let's look at the other way. I'm sorry, these aren't the most exciting graphs, right? But we get the point. Here's respiratory alkalosis. So again, if you hyperventilate, you're blowing off CO2, right? And so that puts you into this situation where you have low pCO2. That's referred to as hypocapnia, okay? And that can easily push the pH of the blood above 8. We don't want that to happen. We die, right? That gives you brain injury. It messes you up. Okay. What causes you to hyperventilate would be things like being at altitude, right? So you change, in that case, your respiratory rate to try to get enough oxygen. But while you're getting enough oxygen, you're blowing off too much CO2. Again, having someone kind of dialed wrong on a mechanical ventilator, or here's where I was going, brain injury. So if the portion of the brain, let's say the medulla oblongata, that's regulating respiratory rate, that could throw things off as well. Stress and fear, right? We often think about hyperventilating as like I'm freaking out. Absolutely. That can lead to respiratory alkalosis, but you should also pass out before anything really bad happens to you. And that would correct in that case, right? You're no longer freaking out when you're passed out. And so that one should correct itself. Your breathing rate will return to normal. So when you're in this situation of alkaline blood, so not enough hydrogen anymore, right? We see respiratory compensation. As long as there's nothing wrong with the lung, we should move to a lower respiratory rate. Right? Stop hyperventilating, breathe into a paper bag, get more of the CO2, right? So slow down that respiratory rate. Renal compensation, absolutely. We should at this point be reabsorbing hydrogen and secreting bicarbonate into the urine, right? Do hold on to those hydrogens, right? And that should bring us back to normal. For metabolic acidosis, and we already did metabolic, what am I missing? Oh, they don't give me a metabolic alkalosis. They don't give me metabolic alkalosis picture. This is metabolic acidosis from that bicarbonate loss that we mentioned in things like chronic diarrhea. So no picture. Metabolic alkalosis. You get this like a little bit with what we call alkaline tide. Remember when you eat and you're producing all that hydrogen to go be hydrochloric acid in the stomach, the bicarbonate goes into your blood. That's referred to as alkaline tide. And so typically what you would expect is as your blood becomes more alkaline, typically the lung is just going to step in and change the respiratory rate, right? So if you don't have enough hydrogen, what you need to do is increase your PCO2, right? Just slow the ventilation rate a little bit and you can deal with that alkaline tide. More serious would be as if you were constantly vomiting. So something like hyperemesis gravidarum. It's in pregnancy. It's morning sickness in pregnancy, but really extreme. Like so, tons and tons of vomiting. Then the stomach keeps trying to replace the hydrochloric acid, and you're getting way more bicarbonate in the blood. Again, the kidney should be compensating. It should dump the bicarbonate. The lung should be compensating. Right? You decrease the breathing rate to up the PCO2 to drop the pH again. So these acid-base balances, I will say, you come across this a lot in a lot of different disease states. I think it's something that we probably don't think about enough, but you're about to think about it a whole lot more if you're going to nursing school. I did include this. I thought this was a really useful chart. We use this some actually in my pathophysiology class. Because if you think someone has an acid-base disorder, right, the easiest way to find that out is to check their blood pH, right? That would come back in a blood lab, and you can see that what causes, what the cutoff is for acidosis and what the cutoff is for alkalosis. And then from there, if you're trying to decide if the problem is metabolic or respiratory, you can check the PCO2 levels, right? That's going to tell you what's going on at the lung. And then without getting into too much detail here, you can also check things like bicarbonate levels to figure out if the patient's body has been compensating for it and actually has corrected a lot of the problem, but maybe still needs intervention, or if this is uncompensated, if this is acute, if this is something new. And then anion gap, remember we looked at where the anions should be at. And so something like bicarbonate is probably the main one that we're looking at. So if someone's losing a lot of bicarbonate, we're going to see fewer anions than we should normally. Anyway, you might like this image in your future classes, so I threw that in. Okay, that was a long one. Good stuff. Again, mostly review. So I'm thinking we really focus in, I think acid-base balance is what students tend to have the hardest time with. So definitely plan on spending some time there, but definitely write down any questions that you have as you're going through the chapter, and we will address them in class. All right, have a great weekend.